Steering the Shift, Board Leadership in Times of Transformation. Welcome to the Better Boards podcast series, the podcast for chairs, CEOs, non-executive directors, company secretaries, and their advisors. Every episode is filled with practical insights and learnings from those inside boardrooms. We discuss what really matters and highlight actionable steps you can take to enhance the performance of your board. In today's episode, we are diving into one of the most critical junctures in organizational life, the moment when transformation isn't just an option, it's a necessity. When the stakes are high and the future is uncertain, what role should board members play? How do they go beyond oversight and become catalysts for change? We'll unpack the essential questions board members should ask when transformation is on the table, explore how to work effectively with executive teams and external partners, and tackle the thorny question, should every board have transformation experience at its core? Why are we covering this in this podcast series? Well, in our board evaluations, we see that there is a big gap between the perceived importance of transformation and the perceived status of know-how on boards when it comes to transformation. And as there are so many changes organizations are currently grappling with, these of its technological changes, AI, etc., transformation is on the cards for so many organizations. So I'm really looking forward to speak with Lan O'Connor. She's a global transformation leader with deep experience in enterprise change. She was part of Capgemini when Capgemini was not what Capgemini is today, when it was a European organization, at the time when it made the decision to become a global organization. And she was part of the team that led basically the organization through this transformation. Her board experience spans also Trinity Business School, landmark transformation, and commercial policy at the UK Cabinet Office during COVID-19. She has an MBA from Trinity College, a governance diploma, and her career was spent in Europe, the US, India, and South Africa. So I'm absolutely delighted that she makes the time and contributes to the Better Boards podcast series. Lan, thank you so much for contributing to the Better Boards podcast series.
Oh, Sabine, thank you for having me.
No, we have a really exciting topic on a Sunday afternoon. So we are recording this on a Sunday because Lan is very busy. So thank you so much for doing this, even on a Sunday.
Even on a Sunday. This is how I spend my Sundays.
Let's jump straight in. Transformation. What distinguishes transformation, a transformation program, from a routine change?
I'm glad you used the word routine and routine change. We all know that change is part of life, part of business life. But transformation, I would say, thinking about transformation with a capital T, it's not a change. It's a moment of what biologists sometimes call punctuated equilibrium. How about that for a Sunday afternoon? It's a deliberate, intentional break from a successful past towards a necessary future. It could be triggered. For example, AI is triggering a lot of these conversations at boards right now. Is AI an opportunity, a risk, safely ignored? If you think of my own personal experience at Capgemini, it's hard to imagine Capgemini was ever not a global organization. But at one point, it was not. And it was a distinct decision to move away from a super successful European model, even a powerhouse, to becoming a global competitor on a whole new stage. It wasn't a tweak. It was a fundamental rewiring of the power, structure, KPIs, and rebalancing the entire center of gravity towards something new without losing the cultural core. So if you ask me, force me, as I know you have a tendency to do, to say, well, what are the 2-3 things that really are the difference? First of all, let's say 3 things. One, there's total agreement that the current equilibrium is no longer viable. Second, the target is articulated. It's not just a vague direction, but it's articulated in measurable outcomes: market share, growth, presence, or new corporate structure, for example. And third, the business case is watertight. And this is where we'll probably come onto this, I'm guessing, where the board has a very distinct role. And I would say, I'd add a fourth, if I'm allowed to add a fourth. The scale is so immense that it becomes like the singular agenda for the executive team and the board for the duration of the transformation. Transformation, as you said, it's not routine change. It's not everyday change. It's a period of time. And I'd say, to use a movie analogy, it's a blockbuster. It's a blockbuster movie where the CEO is the protagonist and the board are the executive producers. How about that?
No, that's fantastic. That's a great start. Because we are hearing a lot. Look, when we do these board evaluations, we are hearing a lot about transformation, and a lot of organizations are thinking about this complete reset. And what we discover, I mentioned it briefly in the introduction, is that there is such a big gap between the perceived importance of transformation and the perceived state of know-how on boards when it comes to transformation.
Okay.
So let's talk a little bit about what does it mean for the role of a board? How does a board need to recalibrate their role, really?
Yeah, Sabine, what a question. So for a board, often a transformation with a capital T is perceived as a risk with a capital R. And so that's absolutely at the heart of what a board is all about. So therefore, the role of the board when it comes to a proposed transformation, it's not passive oversight, it's active strategic engagement. And all of those three things are important. It's active, so there's a role to play. It's strategic, it's got a horizon, and it's engagement. And if you want to, I'll go back to the power of three. I think it's a Sabine motto, the power of three. There's probably critical moments. The first moment might be challenging the why. So the first board meeting on the topic of transformation, I would suggest it's not an agenda item, it's the agenda. So it's a point where the board's role is to rigorously challenge the necessity to act. Is there a new future? Is this trigger, whatever it is, AI, competition, regulation, really requiring of a transformation? What are the alternatives? And what is the true cost of doing nothing? So that's challenge the why, first moment. Second, pretty quickly, having decided that, yes, this is the moment, approve the rationale. To do that, you need a deep dive, obviously, as to why the current situation is not adequate to continue. So this is where the challenge, the improvement of the rationale, and ultimately the approval of the business case. It's the moment that the board signs off on the destination, absolutely core to what a normal board role is. And in a transformation proposal, it's no different. And then finally, the third moment, and I think this is where boards maybe don't get as engaged as they might otherwise, is scrutinize the approach, not just why it has to be done, what has to be done, but also how it's going to be done. The business case can be flawless, but the execution plan is where failure hides. That's what I would say. It's not a deep dive on program management. It's, for all intents and purposes, let's say a Dragon's Den moment. I don't know if everybody knows what the Dragon's Den is, but it's the moment where you say, I'm investing investor money in a return. Do I believe in it?
It sounds so easy. Yeah.
I don't know, I stunned you into silence, sorry.
Yeah, but we know it's not. So
No.
What mindset, skills and experience should board members really bring to the table when transformation is proposed?
Oh, right. Well, I think boards, well-balanced boards, having had people like yourself getting involved, but a well-balanced board has incredible experience in the room. And that experience can really be brought to bear. And I would say there's probably three things to test. We are back at three, but this is one of those mantras, if you like, that I use nearly every day. And it's checking the rational, the political, and the emotional. The rational being what we talked about, the business case. The political is, are we set up to make the decisions, to escalate issues, and to commit to the action? So the board must be set up itself and ensure that management is set up for the tough decisions. And what does that look like? And finally, when I talked about emotional, I don't mean that everybody gets excited, but there will be tough times in a transformation, and there has to be some kind of emotional commitment. Mm-hmm. So this is where the magic is, but it's where, for example, the people in the organization in question identify with the future. they believe in it, they can see it, they understand it and want to be part of it, to the point where they may demand faster action or different action from board or executive. That's emotional commitment. So the role of the board is to ensure that all of these three are in place, not as a watchdog, not monitoring, but as a strategic partner. It can be like the most critical venture the organization, the company will undertake. If you go back to the blockbuster movie, you don't really want too many of those in your life. And the transformation steps are such that they are marked periods of time in the history of an organization, but they need a beginning, middle, and end. And it's the board's role to make sure that it does have a good beginning, a powerful middle, but the end point allows the company to breathe at the new level, the new equilibrium, as we talked about before. I don't know if that's the answer to your question, Sabina. I feel like I may have kind of started to share more of my mantras than you expected.
No, absolutely. Really insightful. I'm just thinking ahead here now.
Sure.
What does it really mean? What type of people do we really need who can do this? So, for example, should boards include directors with direct transformation experience? Or is a mere strategic oversight enough?
Okay. Well, you can probably guess my answer to this one. Of course, I would say that direct transformation experience is a fantastic asset to have on a board, alongside all the other requirements that the board needs. But there's probably a crucial distinction. Most board members, and this is a great generalization, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you've seen so many boards in operation, but most leaders who make it to a board will have some experience in an organization that was going through transformation, but very few have been the accountable leader.
Correct.
The one responsible for the outcome. And there's quite a nuanced distinction here. So to clarify, they may have been involved in directing or signposting a transformation or approving a transformation, but not necessarily anticipating or dealing with the inevitable ups and downs that come with that kind of work. It's a very different perspective when you're the one living with the volatility of a transformation program. So it's often, if I can use the word, delegated to SMEs, subject matter experts. External consultants are given the task of leading this. It's viewed maybe as a temporary effort or a temporary problem to be solved by temporary people. But the effort may be temporary. In reality, that kind of transformation effort can take 2 to 3 years. It's got its own cadence, its own rhythm, and its own culture. So I'd say one critical element to have at a board level is an ally, somebody who's versed in the psychology of transformation, who understands the human element, the sort of fatigue, the resilience that you need, the breakthroughs and when they happen and why they happen. So it's not really a yes or no answer to your question, I realize, Sabina, but it's more a case of it's being far better to have that deep transformation experience than not to have it. But the clarity on the role is essential. It's the difference between oversight and execution. So the board is not responsible for the execution, but the experience of the board is really crucial. So let's say, for example, you don't need another doer, but board members with the experience I mentioned earlier, having seen it, lived through it, and you can tell me if this happens, why would they not just go and have an offsite, not a strategy offsite, but maybe a lunch where they share the experience? It's a hugely powerful resource. And if it looks like an organization is going to launch into a transformation program, I think that exchange of experience is absolutely valuable and could become one of the pivotal moments, back to our 3 moments of transformation earlier on.
I couldn't agree more. I strongly encourage boards I work with to increase their time with each other, to really understand what each other can bring to the table,
right,
and how they can help to push forward on an issue. So that is a great reminder, not only for transformation, but also for other issues. Yeah, but absolutely, I wholeheartedly agree, Lan.
Okay.
Let's get a little bit more practical. So when the transformation is on the horizon or it's discussed, what are the critical questions board members should ask before approving a transformation program?
Oh, okay. Right, fantastic. So we talked about earlier on the rational, emotional, and political. The rational is just, it's table stakes for the exercise. But I think there's something about assessing the team. So in other words, I mentioned a Dragon's Den moment beforehand. So I think having got that, you then as a board need to set up that cadence, invest in understanding what the proposed cadence is, what the proposed engagement for the board is. And I always say to board members or even executive board members who have to deal on a regular basis, for example, in investor relations or investor days, to adopt a kind of an interview mindset. Assume at any moment you could be called upon for a short interview to explain why your organization is taking this on and what the tangible benefits are going to be for stakeholders. So as you go through the cadence of the transformation, every update that you receive from the organization, from the transformation leaders, ask that question. Can I summarize this? Could I do a piece to camera explaining why we're doing this transformation, how it's progressing? And then secondly, even as the transformation starts, but certainly as the deep dive happens and as the early updates come along, there's another mantra that what next? We're all very familiar with this, but I think it's really important to be clear as a board as to what you're approving. What's happened? What progress have you made? So why does this matter to the original target for the transformation? And what next? What are the immediate actions? It cuts through a lot of jargon, and especially when you think about every other item on the agenda for the board, the transformation can often be, just a quick update on progress. But I think it's absolutely incumbent on the board not to let that happen, but to ask these questions. What happened? So why does that matter? And what next? What are the immediate actions? Never lose sight of how the changes are affecting customers, employees, and partners. And in fact, if I think back to my education on corporate governance, the stakeholder engagement, stakeholder risk, stakeholder interests are an absolutely critical part of the whole transformation from the start to the finish. And you can say, I mentioned earlier on the impact on everybody who works in that company, everybody who's part of that organization. Sometimes I call it the walk from the boardroom to the canteen and back again. And I think you said, how should a board get engaged? There's nothing better than going to see what's happening. I don't think there's any rule that says a board member cannot spend time in an organization, not directing it or pretending to be an executive, but certainly absorbing the impact of a change, the impact of a transformation. So I'd say start with the right mindset of curiosity. Why is this happening? Harness the board's collective wisdom and use those little frameworks or reminders like the interview test and what next. And then finally get out of the boardroom, see the change for yourself.
So fantastic. You mentioned a couple of words also earlier on, like that this is something where board members have to become more active. And now some listeners might think, oh my goodness, I can remember the last time that I stepped on the toes of some executives or executives listening to this and say, oh my God, no, I don't want any of those board members. So how can board members effectively engage with an executive team without really overstepping and getting into the operational territory?
That's a great question. I'm going to give you the answer you don't want, which is how long is a piece of string? I think the last thing I mentioned, was about the walk from the boardroom to the canteen and back again. It's so much more effective for an executive team that's trying to drive a transformation that the board understands from having had some exposure why something's not going in the direction we want, why it's taking longer, why it's being refocused. And I think there's a shorthand which the board and the executives can build between themselves, which is allowing some kind of direct engagement. I hear what you say, Sabine, about executives saying, oh, I don't want board members interfering with my business. And equally, board members being reminding themselves that it goes beyond the remit of their strict accountability. And that's true. But I think the experience of boards didn't begin the day they became board members. They've come from business, education, very complex organizations typically. And so they have a sense of how difficult things are to make happen. And there is definitely a formal role for boards. I'd even say there's a formal role for friends of boards, insofar as sometimes an external perspective can give you a very clear view as to whether the proposed transformation or the actual transformation is heading in the right direction. And to that end, you can engage with industry analysts, market analysts in a friendly way to say, well, given this direction that we're heading in, what do you think the chances of success are? You may want to cut this out of the edit, but there are very good relationships between boards and analysts, which I think can be very helpful in clarifying whether transformational direction is correct. And just getting that perspective. You won't necessarily change your direction based on what they say, but you can see how they're going to interpret it. So boards and executives have joint accountability for those kind of relationships, and that's not overstepping any mark. Sabine, I don't know if that's answering your question. Mm. And I'd always say that there are set pieces, let's call them, where in a controlled way, board members and executives can share a sense of the direction and purpose and ultimate target for transformation. And I'll tell you a little story, which comes from Capgemini days, where we brought the board to India because we'd acquired an Indian company. We were growing up, and a very large focus of the exercise was to expand our footprint all around the world. And India was clearly a very important part of that. And we brought the board to a Jashna, a big party that we were having in Mumbai at the time, so that they could come and see what it means, understand the culture. And a lot of the board members were French. And at the Jashna, obviously, we had a lot of beautiful food, specifically Indian food. And I always say that the French board members discovered that the Indian culture was very strongly based on cuisine and food. And that was the bottom of the zip, if you like, that they they just attached the bottom of the zip. We both love food. Zip, everything was fine.
Fantastic.
Who knows?
Great story. Great story. Great story. I love food.
Me too.
But it's this, what connects at the end of the day. And it's so vital. And what connects is sometimes outside the boardroom. And you need to have the mindset to explore this. And don't just sit there and focus too narrowly. It's a brilliant story.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, people are people. Until the bots take over, people are people. And I think curiosity, openness, just human emotions and human characteristics are going to be what would make up that third part, rational, political, emotional. And that, I guess that story about the Indian food and the French food tells you where the emotional bit sat.
Amazing. There are so many more questions I could ask, but I would like to formally invite you to do another podcast. It's such an important topic, particularly at the moment. But for this podcast, for this episode, we have to sadly come to an end. So there's always the same question I ask at the end, which is, what are the 3 key takeaways from our conversations? What should listeners take away from this conversation?
All right. Sabine, I listened to the Better Boards podcast, and this is the bit that fills me with trepidation when you say, what are the 3 things? So I feel this is you checking my homework. So let me give this one a go. I'd say something that I've repeated during our conversation here, which is the rational, political, emotional. If you walk away from this podcast saying, I wish you would have stopped talking about this, then I've done my job. AKA business case, decision-making, engagement. There's the 3 things that really are important, and it sits very much at the heart of the board. So that's number 1. And then the second is transformation is not forever, but it's also not a transaction. It's not a drop it and go. It's not a decision made. It's a specific action for a period of time, beginning, middle, end. During that time, the culture of the company may be slightly different. But that's where the board has real value and responsibility, ensuring the scale is right, the approach is coherent, and that the interests of stakeholders are recognized. So it's not forever, but it's not a transaction. And then the third, it sounds obvious, but when a transformation is initiated, it's an identifiable moment in time, maybe even a date when an organization decides it's time to change. But equally, there comes a time when you say it's done. Okay, celebrate it. And maybe it's a little bit like the previous point, beginning, middle, and end. But maybe if I could have a fourth, Is that permitted?
Yeah, absolutely.
Under the rules of Better Boards podcast? Okay.
Go for it.
I just a final thought, as I was saying that, transformation practitioners are SMEs, subject matter experts. Whether you choose to have that in the board or outside the board, in the executive or outside the executive, it may be an uncomfortable conversation, but it's useful to have that external perspective, an SME perspective on your transformation plan. And then, could I finish with a question?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And if anybody's listening to this and you're on the board of an organization where your sense, your knowledge, your experience, convince you that something has to change, punctuated equilibrium, the as is no longer viable, what are you going to do about it?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lan, for contributing to the Better Boards podcast series.
Well, thank you, Sabine. Thank you for inviting me.
This podcast episode is part of the Better Boards podcast series, brought to you by Better Boards, the provider of board evaluation solutions. Get in touch if you would like to hear more about our work, or if you would like to see a demo of our innovative board evaluation platform that clients use for their internal or as part of a fully facilitated external board evaluation. We at Better Boards are always delighted to hear from you. You can best reach us at info@better-boards.com. Thank you so much for listening.